Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Innovation Showcase. The main purpose of this ongoing series is to inform viewers about exciting innovations and creative individuals across the fields of business, science, technology, education, and the arts. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Mike Odell. Based in Oklahoma City, Mike is a nurse anesthetist, and he's also the founder and now serves as the CEO and creative director of Legit Kits, a company that specializes in high quality foundation paper piecing quilt kits that allow users to create intricate, visually stunning quilt designs even if they're beginners. During the program, we're learning why and how Legit Kits came about and how it's grown, developed, and operates today. In the process, we'll come to better understand and appreciate the technology involved and the wide range of designs to choose from. Let's start by meeting Mike and then finding out all about Legit Kits. Mike, so good you're here. Thanks for taking the time.
Jay, I'm so thankful for this opportunity. Thank you for having me on your show. This is great.
And I just
Glad.
love the background. We can really appreciate throughout our discussion the designs you've created, incredible designs, and just the story of the company is fascinating. But before we jump right to that, could you start by briefly sharing maybe a little bit about your background and then how your interest in quilting came about?
Yeah, so I've been a certified registered nurse anesthetist since 2011. And before that, I was a registered nurse traveling in ICUs across the country. I've been in healthcare my entire adult life, but I've always been artistic. I've always been doodling on paper. I've taken classes in pottery, glass blowing, cake decorating, sculpture. I carve wood. I like to play with different media. And when my wife got into quilting, I didn't think much about it at first because I thought of the more traditional quilts out there, and I do think they're really neat. They have a lot of good craftsmanship, but they weren't really something that I was like, I've got to do this. But then we went to a show. We went to a quilt show with that was put on by the Tulsa Modern Quilt Guild, and some of those quilts just there were different takes on how you could make a quilt, and I found that to be fascinating. I love big art, and the thing about big art is, if I want to make a painting, if I wanted to paint a stormtrooper or whatever, um, that wouldn't be allowed to be in my house, and my garage is already full of tools, so there's no place to hang something like that. But if you're making a quilt out of something cool, there's a place for it. You can put it on your bed, or and I didn't realize this until I got into it, but a lot of people use them as wall hangings as well. So
Mhm.
they're works of art that you can make yourself, and they're the thing that really sticks with me is quilts are the thing that lasts longer than anything else. When you if you've got anything from a distant relative, somebody you don't even know because they passed before you were around, there's a quilt from them.
Mm.
So it's a legacy on top of just being an art form, and that was actually pretty profound for me to think about. I looked up what the oldest intact quilt is, and it's called the Tristan quilt. It was made in Italy over 600 years ago. It was made at the same time the Canterbury Tales were being written.
Wow.
It's the colors are gone just because ancient dyes were, and I don't know how long modern dyes will last, but I think ours will last a long time. It's all whited out, but there's trapunto and handwork on it, so it's got imagery on it. And scholars believe that it was likely given as a wedding gift
Huh.
600 years
Interesting.
ago, and it's still there. And it's in a museum in England.
How
So
did your background in computer graphics play into your eventual entry into the quilt field?
my first job was at a computer company, and I was drawing images pixel by pixel for them. I got in because my mom worked there, and the boss came over and saw some stuff that I'd written as a teenager, and I got hired in their graphics department. And so I started drawing things back in the 90s, pixel by pixel. And back then, the pixels were pretty big. My wife's first quilt was a 9-patch quilt, which is where you're sewing little patches together in a 3 by 3 grid.
Mhm.
And so I immediately was like, that's pixels right there. And so that got me to design my first quilt. It was just a throwback to something I'd done before.
And can you take us from there to what that was and then how things started to take off from there?
Yeah, so I, as a personal quilt for my middle son, he wanted a Dark Vader quilt. So I made him a Darth Vader quilt out of pixels. This one is 1,260 pixels sewn together. Don't look at it too closely. There aren't very many straight lines in there because it was my first attempt. Prior to quilting, I took up sewing because, for one, I wanted to be Braveheart for Halloween one year, and I couldn't find a costume that worked. I was like, well, I'll just make one. And I found over time that my favorite thing to do is to take my ideas and turn them into reality. So with this Darth Vader pixel quilt, I did that for my middle son, and he loved it. And then for the back of it, I wanted to put his TIE fighter on there, so that spaceship on the back. And so I told my wife that, I want to do this angular spaceship with a little bit of shading on it, but I don't want to do it out of pixels. I want straight lines on it. And she said that sounds like paper piecing. And so what is that? So I Googled it, and paper piecing is where you sew through paper. You draw a pattern on paper, and then you sew through that paper, sew your fabric on through that paper, and it gives you these really accurate lines. It gives you these straight lines. And so the back of that Darth Vader quilt is actually my first ever pattern. Is his TIE fighter. Uh, really simple, but the that process just made sense to me, and it gave me more ideas. While I was online looking for stormtrooper art to do my second quilt, which is a pixel quilt of a stormtrooper, same 1,260 pixels. Um, I found this art by a guy named Liam Brazier. He's out of UK, and it was this awesome image of a stormtrooper kind of just looking down at you. And I love the lines, I love the angles, I love the composition of that image. So it just was really powerful to me, and I wanted to make that into a quilt. And I had no idea how I could do that because seams are tricky. The way they intersect is a problem, and it was going to be this huge project. So um, I started writing out the pattern. I knew I was going to screw it up, first of all, because I just knew it was. I knew it wasn't going to be great the first try. So I drew this thing at full scale on my dining room floor. I got on my hands and knees and I crawled around and drew it out. Um, and I got in touch with the artist as well. I said, "Hey, so I'd like to make a quilt pattern out of this, and if possible, is this something that I could maybe sell?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, that sounds great." And I said, "Well, what kind of royalty do you want?" He's like, "Oh, I don't, whatever you want to pay me." Very easy. I mean,
Hmm.
tough negotiation there, hard business there. And I was like, "Oh, that's great." He said, "The thing is, a couple of people have asked me if they could do this, and I've told them yes, but they've never been able to pull it off." And that was exactly what I wanted to hear. Oh, this is hard. Okay. I like difficult challenges. And so I set about, with very little experience in the field, I set about making my own pattern for this thing. And so I drew it at full scale because I knew this should be done by computer, but I didn't have the skills. I haven't kept up with technology. I've been in healthcare. I'm really good at putting hoses in people, but as far as operating the newest equipment, or software, it's just not my strong point. So I knew how I could do it by hand. So I drew it full scale, and then I cut it into pages that could fit on my scanner, so I could have a backup copy of it. And I also felt like the smaller things are going to be easier to work with on a sewing machine. And that actually created the Legit Kits block system that we use to this day. All of our quilts are made out of 7.5 by 10-inch blocks because that leaves you enough room for seam allowances in the margins of a standard piece of paper. And it just kind of went from there. It took me 18 months to write that first pattern. I
Wow.
created all kinds of problems by coming up with this technique, and one of which was I use way more color than most everybody else uses. Most quilt patterns are designed with about 16 colors, and that throws back to computers as well. In the 90s, we had a computer that had a CGA card, a color graphics adapter card, And that had 4 colors, and 2 of those were black and white. Then it had cyan and magenta, right? And so that's what I started out with in computers. And then we upgraded to an EGA card, which had 16 shades, which is about what most quilt patterns are made out of, because that's a reasonable number of fabrics to pick out in a day trip to a fabric shop. Some people will be offended by that because they could pick out way more than that. But it's enough to give you a little bit of shading and a little bit of depth. But the big leap for computers was when we went from EGA to VGA, the variable graphics adapter, and that had 256 shades. So what I wanted to do was I said, like, I want to take quilts to VGA, because Kaufman Fabrics, which is what these quilts behind me are made out of, they have 365 colors.
Mm.
So
Wow.
I was like, I'll use the whole library. But then when you come up with 365 colors, how do you organize all that?
Yeah.
So I came up with a simple letter code. Each color got its own letter assignment, and that's standard across the board. And that's how we organize our colors. So regardless of what pattern it's in, if the letter code is AA, it stays that same code all the way across the line. And that's how we actually organize and cut everything here.
No,
So, oh, please, I've gone on a tangent.
no, no, no. Very interesting. And I think you helped give us an understanding of the paper piecing that's at the essence of your quilting design. Um, could you share a little bit, and you got into it at the start, of your beginning in 2020 and how things have really mushroomed since then?
2020 was a rough year. So I started writing that pattern in mid 2018, and I didn't launch the company until 2020. And we ended up not selling any of the Star Wars stuff. There's license agreements, there's intellectual property issues with that, and I just decided I did a couple of Star Wars style quilts, and that was kind of how I built the company. Was just looking at how do we write these patterns, and once we'd done a couple of really cool patterns, I changed the stuff that we could get the intellectual property rights to, and I appropriated the name Legit Kits because a woman tested that stormtrooper pattern for me, and her boyfriend saw it laying on the bed and said, "Babe, that quilt is legit." And I thought that was great. I'd never heard that sentence before, so I wanted that name. And part of being legit is doing legitimate things. It holds me to a higher standard. There are a lot of Star Wars quilt patterns out there that are just kind of not exactly done with the agreement of Disney. They exist out there, and so I felt like that gave me the rights to do it. And then I was like, "Nah, I can't do that." So I talked to some intellectual property attorneys, and they're like, "Don't do Star Wars." So I'm not.
Mm.
But at some point, I think I'd like to. But licensing agreement with Disney can be a complicated thing to get, and it's an expensive thing to procure. So I'm gonna wait till we're a little bigger before I really start to tangle with Disney. 2020 launched the store. It was gonna be my year. Went live. Had one pattern for sale. It was Autumn the Fox. Our first ever pattern was a fox, and had some sales those first couple of days, and then everything got shut down because of COVID-19. And I got sick. I got sick on St. Patrick's Day of 2020, and
Mm.
I I was training to run a 10K. I'd run 5 miles in less than an hour, and my goal was to get to 6. And I did that on a Sunday. I started coughing on a Wednesday, and by Friday I could barely walk to the bathroom adjacent to my bedroom.
Wow.
And it took me an hour to recover from that. Um, and I just was absolutely exhausted, and it stayed that way. I missed 9 weeks of work. I wasn't sure if I was ever going to be able to work again.
Ooh.
It gave Legit Kits a lot of urgency, because I could lay in bed with my phone. I ended up hiring people. I knew this needed to be done by computers. Like I said, I hired graphic design artists. I got coached by a local entrepreneur that I met through real estate here in Oklahoma City on how to launch a company. I hired somebody to cut fabric. I did a lot of the work myself in the beginning, but over time, I've been giving people jobs. And that's been pretty humbling because I've realized that I'm not really good at anything. Like, I'm the idea guy, but a day after I give somebody a job, they're doing it better than I than I was doing it, right? And that's been humbling, but it's also been empowering. Um, I my wife tells me that I have probably have ADD, and I have yet to come up with an argument, a cogent argument to the contrary. But being a business owner with ADD, I feel like I keep it fairly under control. It allows me, I have all these ideas, and I feel like those first quilts were this collision of ideas in my head. And as somebody who jumps around a lot, as a business owner, I now have people who can carry out those thoughts. So it's like having a superpower. My employees are freaking wonderful. I started out with one employee and a couple of graphic design artists. Now I have 7 full-time employees here and multiple graphic design artists that I work with on a freelance basis. And I have a road crew that goes to shows. We have a certified instructor program. It's ballooned since then. 2020 was going back to 2020. Sorry, it was a slow start. It was hard because I was sick. It was really hard to find fabric in 2020.
Mm.
Um, Everybody bought all the fabric they could get hold of to make masks. And so launching a quilt pattern company, especially as somebody who had to buy fabric at retail, was extremely challenging in 2020, but I just kept buggering on. I believed in it. The first few customers loved it. I had a ton of feedback. Um, I used social media to help develop legit kits. So, I wasn't really a quilter when I started writing patterns. Um, and the strength in that was I had to write patterns for a moron beginner like myself. I had to write patterns for a beginner like myself. So, in doing that, uh, I felt like I had an advantage because most people who write quilt patterns are expert quilters. And it's easy as an expert to make assumptions that people know stuff they just don't know. So I
Mm.
had to make all these patterns in a way that there are no Y seams. And I can explain that if you'd like. But a Y seam is a technical seam that you have to use some tricks to get right. And if you don't get it right, you end up with a pretty bad pucker. And on one of our quilts, that would be a big deal. So I had to have these patterns written in a way that there are no crazy intersections in any of these seams. Now we do have some bulky seams with all the highly detailed quilts we do, but everything is a straight line.
Mm.
There are no curves to sew in any legit kits projects. They're all Y seam free. They're highly organized. They have to be because of the level of detail in them. And these really speak to people who love to do detail work. Our customers compare these to having to make the piece of a jigsaw, and then you have to build the pieces to the jigsaw puzzle and then put the puzzle together. And of course, we have instructions. We don't just send you a pile of fabric and say make a car out of this or whatever. We send you all the fabric that you need. And so by developing this on social media, I asked hundreds of quilters over the course of time, what do you want? What if you could design a quilt kit? What would you want in it? And the answer was always plenty of fabric. A lot of companies, watching that bottom line, they want to shrink down that fabric allotment to just barely what you need. And so that means if you screw up once, well, now you don't have enough fabric to finish your project. And um, so I went the other way. We give too much fabric. We actually have an enough fabric guarantee. If you buy a full kit from Legit Kits and you lose the color, you cut it wrong, your cat eats it, you spill wine on it, or whatever. We don't need the reason. We'll send you another piece in the mail at no charge because we want you to finish these things. Because to me, if you finish one of these quilts, you're going to show this thing to everybody that you know. And for one, they're going to think you're a wizard and you're going to want to do another one. And two, um, they're going to other people are going to want to do this too, especially when you tell them, it took a while, but it was easy. Because, if you're going to spend your time working on a hobby, I really can't think of a better way to do that. I know I'm biased because I own this company, but like I said before, this is something that's going to last for generations.
Oh, they're
Um,
so gorgeous, as we can see here, the lion, and we're fortunate just to add to your explanation of how you and others put them together is we have this wonderful back pattern. Could you share a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we can zoom in, but if we look at this block B1 in that upper left corner, that one's a pretty easy one to show. So this is the backside of that lion quilt, and it has all the pages still on it. And you can see that in the middle of the picture, there's a lot of detail, and I can get into that in a minute. But you see that on B1, you see one, and then two, and then three in the corner, and then four, five, six. Those numbers are the order in which you sew those fabrics to it. And then there's that 2-letter code for each different shade. So what
Ah,
you do is you take those fabrics and you line fabric one up with fabric two using those color codes. And that is OZ to RA. So you're going to put RA under OZ under number one and then sew that line. And then you flip RA down into place and that traps the seam underneath it so you don't see it. And then you just add the number three, number four, number five. And then that one is done. And then you sew the next one. So you sew all these blocks individually and then you sew them together into that larger quilt. And looking at the other side of the lion, Legit Kit spends a ton of energy in composition. So what I want is I don't usually go for symmetry because that's not interesting to the human eye. And if it happens to be an animal, we focus details in the part that the human eye is drawn to.
mm,
And that I believe bridges the gap between craft and art. I've gotten some flack about this. I'm not gonna say that only Legit Kit's quilts are art. There's a lot of artistic quilts out there. But what I'm trying to do is have each one of our quilts be an independent work of art. And so with the lion, the first thing you do is you look at the eyes. That is human nature. You look straight at the eyes.
yeah.
And then once you're looking at this line, what probably happened was you looked at the eyes and then down to the nose and then down to the mouth. And then your eye tends to go down to that paw on the bottom and then back up to those ears. And you can see those triangles around the island and around the lion, and it brings your view back inside. There's nothing in this design that throws your eyes out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and every triangle is puzzled over with our designs. It's a process to get to the art, and I don't really have a good analogy for it. I go for if it hits me in the chest when I look at it, then we go forward with it. And so I throw away a lot more art than I let go through. I'm constantly trying to push the envelope on what we do as a quilt pattern company. Like with Toasty the Dragon here, I wanted to depict fire with just solid colors. With Scorpio here, I wanted to get the sun shining, through that claw. And here again, you've got really good composition. You've got the sweeping earth, you've got the sweeping tail. Everything brings you down into here, and then it's a feast for the eyes.
Mm.
And so that's what I'm going for with our large art projects.
That's fabulous, fabulous. Mike, what advice do you give or would you give to others who maybe have a creative idea or something they think could take off and be a success, but just don't know if they should do it or how should they go about it? Based on your experience and what you've learned, what might you say to them?
Uh, Read every business book you can get your hands on. I'm a huge fan of MJ DeMarco. He's a straight shooter. He doesn't try and sell you classes or anything else. They're just books about making businesses and
Mm,
how to build a successful one. Get feedback and listen to it. Don't be proud. It takes you got to have an ego to put a company together, but you also have to be able to let go of it to have it succeed. So yeah, the odds of a business succeeding are low, but they're not zero. And if you make a series of good decisions, then you'll get there. Be persistent. Don't quit just because you failed the first time. Keep trying. Maybe it's a matter of timing and you just timed it wrong and you can just start over again.
mm.
I People reach out to me all the time for advice and I freely give it out. My email address, if you want to get in touch with me, is mike@legitkits.com. It's pretty secret. So if you could just keep that private, I'd appreciate it. But no, just stick with it. Listen to your customer base. If you have potential customers, talk to them and say, hey, what what would you like to see? Listen for pain points when people complain about something. I hate it when. I don't like. If you can solve that problem, you have a business.
Now, that's terrific advice. And I have to say, some common points that are made by other successful inventors, business people, have had the good fortune to talk about. It seems so simple in a way. Go to your client base and get feedback. But another thing that really stood out from our conversation is your willingness and seeing the usefulness of delegating responsibility, and being able to let good people do their job. And you, in your case, have the incredible vision for the company. I mean, the unbelievable number of designs you've already made, and I know so many more in the future is your goal. In closing, just very briefly, what are some current and upcoming plans for Legit Kids?
Well, I told you about all 365 shades of Kona, the fabric manufacturer we use. I have one coming up called the Kona Challenge, and it's going to have every one of those colors in it because who doesn't
Wow.
want the whole collection? And we give you too much fabric, so you're going to have that left over to play with. We are working at work. Every fabric manufacturer wants to work with Legit Kits now, especially since we got on Shark Tank, and especially since being featured in articles, and just because our stuff is cool. I've had a lot of people ask me in the past, and I didn't want to go with another fabric manufacturer because that changes all the colors. But we're working on a palette that's compatible across the line. So we can release this it's already in Kona. We can start doing it in Riley Blake's Confetti. We can do it in Bella Solids. There's Michael Miller, there's Art Gallery Fabrics, there's Cherry Wood. I know I've probably forgotten a couple, but what we're doing is we're working on what I call the Rosetta project, where we match those shades across the line, and then we can use a letter code for each one of those colors that works. So we'll actually be reducing our palette in the future, but it'll be compatible with everyone out there, which will
Mm.
allow us to release kits in different fabric lines. We use solid fabric because when you're paper piecing, you flip those triangles up into place, and there's no wrong side with solid fabric because it's dyed through. That also gives you a more permanent um, coloration with your quilts. There's a
Mm.
little close up of our pattern right there too.
Nice, nice. Well,
So lots of plans for the future.
that's great. And I know in our closing credits, we'll have your website, Instagram, email address for those of you who might want to get in direct contact. But unfortunately, Mike, we've come to the end of the program. I want to thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on the success with Legit Kids and continued success with future endeavors.
Thank you so much, Jay. This has been so much fun, and I really appreciate this opportunity. This is
Our Our pleasure. Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.